We're ready to go. We'll call the meeting to order. If we could take a look at the minutes and approve those.
I'll make it a motion to approve.
A motion, do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion is approved. Any unfinished business?
Yes. We didn't get through the previously unresolved issues that had come up in some other meetings, so we'll take those. I believe Melissa put some information in your packet, so why don't we just use those? We'll go through one at a time.
Okay.
The first one, there was discussion on the IACC in regard to Andy Cooper, and we are agreeing that he can be considered the design professional for that. And we did also relax on the requirement for when that he actually has to submit his report because of the seasons and things like that. So we agreed with everything he said. Oh, she did add an exception to the CO 408.2.5, and it says deferred test that cannot be performed at the time of report preparation due to climatic conditions. That's how we, that are on the 90 days period. The next page, I can't remember who brought this issue up. I believe it was Mike Wild. And we put this in here just for his benefit. And I believe the issue was he was concerned about the amount of mortar that goes behind brick. And with the way the walls are constructed and the requirements for the drainage, we don't really see an issue where there is no mortar or a little mortar, 50 or even 100%, because the drainage issue still needs to happen. So with this table, we're recommending to leave things the way they are.
Yeah, Bruce, I think I might have brought it up originally, just asking the question on what percentage is okay. But as I did some more research myself, I think as long as it's allowed still to drain. So you can't have 100% of it filled with mortar, of course, but if it's 95% filled, it's still going to drain as long as there's some hole somewhere. So I agree. I think it's fine to leave it as is.
Yeah, and the reason Mike was talking about that is they had a structure that they were architect and general on that they had some failures on leakage, and it was multiple story masonry that had built up, and they had some problems with that. So I think as you see buildings that are tall brick or tall, masonry on them, that ability for that to get built up more in the bottom is more. And so just, as you look at that, it might be just kind of something to make sure that everybody's aware of, paying attention to the fact that the more you add, you could end up with that bottom being 100% blocked if you don't, pay attention. So that's kind of where I think he was coming from. If you get into multi-story, maybe they should be using a screen material.
That may affect the drainage system.
Yeah, because then if you get into that multi-story, you get enough droppings behind it that eventually it could be totally filled up beyond the wicking capabilities. So it may be something, just kind of a best practices thing to let people know that when you start getting into multi-stories, you maybe should have some of that Brillo pad material on your first floor or something in order to make sure that you're maintaining that drainage ability. So, and I don't know if that's something that's a code issue or more so a best practices to make sure they maintain that drainage.
Kind of all three. It's design. I mean, we're gonna look at it on apartment buildings if they come in like that.
Yeah.
But this is our code, the residential code, so it's not even a required inspection. So it is more of a design and installation in the field requirement.
And I don't think
to
there's
follow.
anything in the commercial building code that specifies the requirements, so the residential is a little more stringent in that regard, which is interesting.
Yeah, well, if you go over the last 3 code cycles, the IBC book used to be bigger than the IRC book,
Not
and
the
it no
case.
longer is by about 300 pages, so, and I think that's, you know, it is what it is, but.
Yep.
Okay, the next one in the packet, I'm going to ask Justin, I believe you're the proponent of this change also. So maybe you can explain to the board. We'll state our position. You're done?
Yeah, this document is actually what Minnesota uses currently for their basement wall connections to the sill plates and the trusses. There's different soil loads listed there, 30, 45, and 60. Of course, we just would be in that 60 pounds a cubic foot range with our clay. But the biggest thing is just requiring a slightly tighter anchor bolt spacing. Because right now, most people are using 6 feet on center, which doesn't work by design. And I think it's just been interpreted different in the code because the code just says your max anchor bolt spacing is 6 feet. That's all it says. And it's not saying that is used for basements or what situations it's used for. It's just giving it an absolute maximum. And as we can tell from the flood requirements, which also say 60 or maybe it's 65 pounds a cubic foot, I can't remember. It's a drastic difference between the two right now. If you have a house in the floodplain and one not in the floodplain, well, that doesn't make any sense when the pressures are the same. So I'm not saying we need to go all the way up to the flood code, of course, but I like what Minnesota has here because they actually had some testing done, and they also had, I think they used an engineering firm as well to help them out with this, to know, okay, if you truly take the values out of the NDS to do calculations on it, this would still not work by design, but what they did was just did testing with these different washers and actually, I think, built a real section of it so it's more practical, and that's where they came up with these values. And to me, going from 6 feet to 4 feet anchor bolt spacing isn't a huge difference in number of anchor bolts, but it does add a lot of strength to the walls.
Well, to start out, the city's stance is going to be to maintain the code the way it is. A few reasons. One is, I mean, Minnesota's been brought up, Moorhead. So we look at the rest of the state first. We're members of the state associations. We confer with our state on its code also. So if we make this amendment, we're going to be different than West Fargo, Horace, the surrounding areas, the other cities. We could certainly bring this amendment to the state also, but we're going to have the same recommendation. And the second point would be is that the code's been that way forever. Maybe it should change, but I made a statement before that it had changed in the past. Well, I went back and I looked and I was wrong. It hasn't changed in the past. It was 2000 all the way till now. It's been the 6 foot maximum. And so I don't know why it's maintained that requirement forever. And that is what generally the country uses. We don't find them amending it. So we'd rather be the same as the rest of the state. The other issue we have is just to take something from Minnesota and plant it into ours. They're not on the same code section we are. There's a lot of detail in here that even conflicts with other code sections in our residential book. Just like I don't understand why we start critiquing Minnesota code, and we find that they put the anchor bolts in here. So now, did they amend the anchor bolt section? Because there's another section that says 6 foot maximum. It's 403. I think it's 403.1. Sill plate anchorage. So I can't tell by looking at this if they amended that section too, or just said refer to this. Other issues are they did a little table here, but in the residential book, there's how many tables? Do you know? How many tables in the book? There's got to be 7 or 8. There's 7 or 8 tables refer to this, and this one just takes an 8-foot wall and a 9-foot wall. The other tables refer to 5-foot walls, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10-foot walls. So then what do we do with 10-foot walls? Do we require engineering on all over 9? We had those are just questions we had.
What are you doing currently for 10-foot walls when someone wants to build one?
Well, it's going to have the same anchor bolt requirement because it doesn't change. That's in a separate section. It's not even in our 404. I believe it's 403 for the 6-foot spacing. So we didn't go look at the whole Minnesota code to see how they changed every section. But whenever we hear Minnesota, we go, they change many things, not just this. So we don't know how the other changes reflect on this table all by itself. We talked about wood foundation walls. You know, that's not even addressed in this section. Maybe even more important. There's not a lot of detail, like at least our engineered flood design has a blocking detail. It's something. Not everybody agrees with what it is, but it's something, and this one just says the floor shall be blocked. So that's the reasons that we say we'd rather stay with the code the way it is. The big one is the state reason. We'd like to be the same as the rest of the state in North Dakota. We did get a letter from HBA. We asked them their stance, and I think it's included in your packet. Their recommendation is also to maintain what we're doing. As far as the city goes, we canvassed the whole staff. We haven't seen failures in our office. Maybe they don't all get to us, but we would think that some of them would have come into our office. And we haven't seen failures. That's our stand.
I guess, Bruce, I kind of go both ways on that. I know I build beyond that code myself, just because I'm not real comfortable with 6 feet. And I think what kind of happens is those that can least afford to fix a problem are the ones that are going to have 6-foot anchor bolts because they're in the homes that are the lowest priced and every nickel's being added up. So my concern kind of rises there some, is that some of those homes that are being built at the very entry-level price market are going to be at 6 foot when maybe they shouldn't.
We haven't even seen those failures, you know.
Yeah.
We have every type of foundation constructed and I don't know, people aren't coming to us when they have issues, but even with the wood foundations, we've heard of the issues with some backfilling issues, things like that, but they haven't come up as being an issue in regard to changing the code.
My fear is that with the deeper basements everyone's building now, you know, it used to be pretty standard, just 8-foot basements, and now we're getting a lot of 9-foot basements, even 10-foot basements. Over time, we'll see, I guess, what the issues are, because the problem is you're not gonna see these things happen in the first 5 years. Takes time for the soil to settle and consolidate, and that's when the pressures start adding up to that 60 pounds a cubic foot. And, you get other areas too, the drainage around the house. Yes, you're supposed to maintain positive drainage, but over time, that'll settle and you'll get water buildup and extra hydrostatic pressure as well. So my fear is just over time, it's just like the houses that were built in the 70s with the unreinforced, ungrouted CMU walls. Those didn't start failing immediately. They took a while. But yeah, it's something to, I haven't talked to the IRC folks about it. Maybe that's something I just need to do myself at a later time and see where they're coming at with their requirement, but.
Bruce, it's probably something that should be addressed at some point, whether it's addressed now or not may be the question, but I'm typically 3 feet or less is what I build, but it's just because for me as a general, that $40 is a lot better than the 40,000 it would take to fix it if it fails. And so I do some preventative things where I build beyond code in certain places where I just want to have less risk as a general. But I'm usually not trying to get to that lowest dollar value home either, so I'm not in that market, so it's not as big of a concern for me that way. But I think Justin does have a valid point, but how it gets addressed is maybe what the choice should be rather than that it doesn't get addressed.
So for the flooding requirements, I understand that's more complex than what we're talking about right now, and it's FEMA related, but I still don't understand the huge difference between the two because the city hired that engineer to look at how to design these walls. But we also have, is it an amendment from FEMA that all our flooding is considered overland flooding, and it's not saturating the soil, correct? That's how we got around some of these requirements, and we just had to make sure the walls were designed
to the pressures of a flood event.
But the flood event, the pressure, it says right in that document that I believe it's 65 pounds a cubic foot is what the pressure is. So not extra water weight or anything. It's not a saturated soil condition. It's just, that's the pressure.
I assume that the flood design did take into account saturation to some point.
It didn't though. It's 65. If you took into account saturated clay, it'd be closer to 100 pounds a cubic foot. So it's not taking that into account. That's why I'm just kind of blown away that it's such a huge difference between the two when the pressures are the same. Because we're allowing clay backfill, correct? We're not requiring granular backfill on homes out of the flood zone.
How is the flood designed? Is that as a granular requirement?
No, it does not.
Doesn't?
So it's the exact same pressure. It just doesn't. You go from one design that needs anchor bolts at 9 inches on center and buttresses every 20 feet and blocking every 24 inches. And then you get out of considered the flood zone, and all of a sudden you can put anchor bolts at 6 feet on center, require no blocking. It's a monstrous difference. Now, I agree that the flood requirement seems to be a little conservative, but not by a factor of 8.
So an engineer decided that, and it was also done with our engineering department in regard to FEMA requirements and keeping that basement exemption. That's everything that we do, is to keep that and never let it go. I don't know if they looked at different designs or not. They maybe did an RFP and took one.
I think the consensus throughout the building industry is that it's a little overkill on that design. But that's typical of engineering anyway, because you're gonna go on the side of making sure that it's not gonna fail, because it's just like I talked about earlier with my risk factor. I'm not gonna engineer something that's gonna fail, period. You should be able to park a truck on top of it or whatever you wanna do with that. So that one's probably overdone, but I think the other one's underdone, so. I'm kinda in between there where I'm saying, personally, I don't do it, but I don't know, you know, if we wanna address it or not, so.
I don't know if, there's a lot of 36-foot walls. Everybody hits a 6-foot. Is 6 foot happening in the field?
On the anchor bolts?
Yeah.
It is on the non-flood, yes.
But that's the requirement, but is that what you see? I mean, I just can't imagine people aren't doing 4 and 5, and they're spacing it out on a wall. Or are they all going 6, 6, 6, 1?
No, they're mostly on the non-flood, you're gonna find 6,
6 foot.
or a little bit less. I'm not sure if they're right there dead on with their tape measures, but, I'm using my wingspan and they're usually well within that.
Otherwise, yeah, they'd have used division or something.
Why are you surprised you mentioned, Bruce, that you're surprised they're not using 4 feet. Why do you say that?
What's that?
Are you surprised that they don't put them at 4 feet? You said you would think that they'd put them at 4 or 5 feet, not 6 feet.
I would think, when I would build, I'd divide it out and make it work. So I'd have a 30-foot wall, I'd divide it out, and 6 doesn't work because you have to pull them in.
Oh, sure.
It would be 4 or 5 feet. That's how I built. And so I was in between there somewhere, just like clay. And I suppose there's people that don't like to think and just, that 6 is the max, and go 6, 6, 6, 6, 1. That happens.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm not saying we should copy, Minnesota's exact page here by any means. You're right. Some things are maybe a little vague as far as the blocking goes and other things. So I don't know if that's something in the future we look at actually providing the details that are needed to do it instead of just trying to put it in words.
Yeah, we do this every 3 years, so we'd like to get it done. And maybe we could set up a committee. The board chairman can certainly set up a committee to look at the issue and see if an amendment, I don't know if it's a requirement that we can't amend at different times of the year. The appeals board kind of runs the code, so.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be opposed to that. The other thing that I would kind of say that comes along with this, you talk about the state or what Minnesota did or whatever. We know in this valley, we have the heaviest soils possible. So for us to go with a national 6-foot code that's working in sand really doesn't, we know better. So it's kind of a little bit of due diligence saying for $40, $50.
Another 5 or 6 bolts.
Yeah. It's not that we're saying you gotta do every foundation to the flood code, which is a pretty expensive thing to do. But we're just kind of looking at what can we do here, a little value added, knowing that we're in really heavy soils, knowing that they're getting, backfilled with big clumps of dirt and things that are banging up against them walls, and maybe if they're got a few more bolts, they can brace it out better when they're backfilling. We have less small cracks in those basements.
So inspections department doesn't usually deal with money, but thinking from the home builder's perspective, and what they're thinking this would change in the industry. So we're looking at just the general scope, and it's like we're going really close to the floodproof foundation requirement. closer to those, they would probably rather have the floodproof requirements be reduced than to do this. So I think when Peter did a code change at ICC, when you do a code change at ICC, you're required to state whether it will increase the cost of construction or not, because that question's always going to come up. And it will, and I'm sure that's why the home builders take the stance that they do. I noticed, that brought it to my attention, they only addressed the anchor bolt spacing in their letter. They didn't maybe even know about the blocking.
Yeah, and home builders is aware of what has to happen in Minnesota, you know, because although the Fargo-Moorhead Home Builders Association doesn't technically legally represent the builders of Minnesota, they pretty much do, because out to about Holly Lake Park is Fargo-Moorhead Builders, not DL Builders. So, I mean, they're aware of what those code issues are, and they do some advocacy and work on Minnesota issues quite often, so they are aware of that. But you know, I guess maybe if we do a task force, take a look at it, you know, I've always kind of argued that if your floor system has got CLBs in it every 5 feet, that's your bracing point. But the code or the systems I've seen don't address it that way. So maybe it's something that we do, maybe get together at home builders and everybody else and see if we can do a couple things to make it a little stronger.
Look at every issue, because there is a lot of detail.
Yeah,
like
you know,
say,
one thing
CLBs, everything is.
One thing I mentioned to Justin before the meeting started here is, you know, now with the sheetrock rules on basements, we have a much stronger floor membrane anyway. So if that's already there, a couple of connections really finishes that deal. Maybe we look at all that, and that isn't addressed in the code per se, that you're gonna sheetrock that ceiling with a 5H rock that, you know, takes that floor system and makes it a much stronger system.
And that joint, because right now that is kind of ignored. I've asked other building officials how they deal with, you know, do they allow them to stop the sheetrock at the truss nearest the wall, let it hang, and that's a little loose right now,
Yeah,
how that sheetrock is connected.
yeah. So maybe we look at that whole situation sometime here and then make an amendment at that time if we need to. But you know, the code has changed enough with the sheetrock rules and what folks are doing there that maybe we tie that whole works in.
So could we do that, Bruce? Can we approve everything, or, you know, leave it as is for now, and then if we find out in a year from now, we can make amendments? Or does amendments have to happen when you adopt the code?
I can look at the bylaws. I don't believe there's anything in there. Anytime there's an issue, I believe you can meet. And you create the agenda. Unless it's an appeal to us, then we hand it over to you to do. So, I mean, we'd like to say we do the code and it's done for 3 years, but I'm not opposed to looking at it again.
Yeah, I just don't want it, I don't want this to hold up approving all the code, so that's where I'd like just taking some time here and doing some research, and if we have to get people together, we can do that, and that's gonna take some time, so I like that idea of just, we'll meet on it and figure it out, but approve the code as is right now and look at it in the future.
All right, I think everybody's good with that, so.
And that was the last one, I believe. Yep. So, that's all we have for unfinished.
Well, we will move on to new business then, which is a review of all the amendments for the proposed adoption.
Melissa has included all the minutes of all the meetings in your packet, so you have already reviewed and approved all those. So the last one is to get the final minutes in this meeting. And so the recommended motion, if you want to read it, Clay, you can do it. But it pretty much says, we've gone through all the codes, we reviewed all the amendments, and you direct me to send my action to the city attorney and commission for their final review and approval.
I've got a question, I don't know if anybody else does before we go beyond that, on a couple of things that we had did earlier, so. One that I have, and this would be for Ryan, that fire watch for structures over 40 feet. Are we going to, we had discussed whether we were gonna put together some type of handout or ruling or something that we could give to developers to, in general, to understand when that's gonna possibly be an issue. Has that been addressed?
I don't have a handout today. We could certainly have a policy directed by the fire chief on how that would work. We've done a similar thing with the section 510 for the emergency radio coverage, because that is worded very broadly too, where it says that all new buildings, are required for radio coverage. While we're not going around asking every apartment building to put in a repeater system. And so essentially what happened on that is the chief wrote up policy saying that, this is for target hazard buildings, schools, construction over, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but 100,000 square feet, or heavily constructed or deep basements, that type of thing. So I think that the same thing would be with that protection during construction would probably be centered around size of unprotected or location. Because obviously if we're looking at something downtown that's all wood and very large constructed, that might be a bigger problem for us than if we're out on 66th Avenue South and completely
Or
isolated.
you've got hard access to get to
Right.
it?
So I think that we could certainly do that. I don't see us coming out and applying that requirement broadly right now, because I think that there's a lot of ways that a contractor can solve that. Site access, probably the first one, just controlling who's going in and out of there. So my thought was that I didn't think the code needed to be amended, that we could bring policy forward. And I guess if the board wants to see that policy, I could bring that to the board.
Well, I think having a policy on it is essential, mostly because if there isn't some policy that lets a designer and a builder know in that design and pricing thing, which is before code review, that they've got to ask about this and consider that cost factor, we're going to end up with some big fights here between the people in town and the codes department and the city. So I think it's just best that we have that out there as a policy that everybody's aware of. So if it's something that maybe they ask about, show that site plan in a pre-approval, and you guys can weigh in on it at that point, so that we don't have people seeing a big bill for security that they weren't aware of. Just trying to kind of avoid an issue.
Sure.
So,
Would you like that to come back to the board? I mean, if we're having additional meetings after this, I could circulate it among the members too.
yeah, I don't, yeah, I think it's more something that there is a policy out there and that it's that it's something that's made aware and distributed to the different groups in town that design buildings so that they are aware of this change and know that it's coming, so. And we could certainly take a look at it, you know, whether we need to meet on it or not would only be if everybody looks at it and says, yeah, it's okay. Then we probably don't need to have a meeting. If there's some concern, then maybe we do.
Yeah, so it's not really a code change you're talking about, more policy of the fire department?
Correct. Just a policy that's out there that's stated so people are aware of it. Because it could be a significant cost to people. And that isn't saying that it shouldn't happen. It's just saying that they should be aware of it so they can get it in their cost factors and know where they're at with it. And really, especially with as much as we're doing downtown, you know, those sites are really tough to get to. I fully agree with the fact that you'd have a tough time on the 7-story that we're building now if you had a fire in it, because it's got a very small alley and parking below it, and it's just really tough to get to. So, I understand the code, it's just, if that was sprung on a person and you end up with a $25,000 security bill that no one had budgeted, you're gonna have some people screaming at you, and if they know about it up front, they're not gonna like it, but at least they knew about it up front and it's in their budgets.
Is there a contractor group? I always think of AGC, but that's more
I think
road builders.
between the associate and the architectural groups and the home builders groups, that any of those that are involved in that design process, be a newsletter go out to them, you know, letting them know that this is happening, so that they just get it on their list of things to account for in their design.
Be something that fire department could just send out that code and get response to all the groups, because, yeah, we have groups, CSI, architect groups, and contractors are a little harder to get to. I have my own email group. I get a third of them back saying that they moved to Hawaii. But
This year might be
if
half
it's
of
just
it.
policy, then Ryan could take care of that.
Yep, yeah, we can distribute that.
He could show you what he's gonna send out.
Oh, that sounds good. Does anybody else have anything else that they would like to?
I got one question for you, Bruce. On page 13 of the city amendments,
Yep.
there's that table showing the backfill of the basement walls. And this one is for when they use a granular fill backfill, so they could use the smaller pressures.
On the IRC?
Yeah. Is this detail out of the IRC, or is this detail a local amended detail? This figure R404.1.2?
I believe that we had that table engineered, is that correct, Hal?
That goes back to, I think, the 2000 code amendment stuff. Ultag did that on behalf of the home builders. Those are home builder amendments initially.
Okay, okay.
You're talking about the one that's got or clay fill on one page and the next one's got that granular?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, on the granular fill, you show the clay on top, but is there a max depth that clay can be when they use a granular backfill?
I don't have that in front of me, so I'm not paying attention or, really able to answer that one right now.
Because the table just shows granular fill and then it shows clay on top, so can it be 6 feet of clay? Can it be 1 feet of clay? What? So I was gonna ask next if it even matters or not. Does anyone, I mean, I'm sure no one even uses that. Everyone just backfills with clay and uses the higher table anyways, I imagine.
At this point, no, I'm sure, yes.
Okay. Okay, well, I just saw that. I wanted to point it out, but if no one uses it, then.
Do we have anything further that anybody wants to address? Okay. With that, I will read this motion. That's a recommended motion for final approval of code adoption. Board of Appeals recommends adoption of the 2018 editions of the International Building Code, the International Fire Code, the International Residential Code, the International Mechanical Code, the International Fuel Gas Code, the International Energy Conservation Code, the International Property Maintenance Code, and the International Existing Building Code, together with the amendments to each, which you will find accompanying this report. The Board of Appeals recommends to the Director of Inspections to provide the City Commission a report of all codes and amendments approved by the board that are associated with the adopting of all 2018 codes reviewed. The Director of Inspections will send final report to the City Commission with the following recommendation for their approval that will result in readings and final adoption by the City Commission. Suggested motion, receive and file this report, and we're going to direct the city attorney to prepare the necessary ordinances for adoption of these codes, together with the recommended amendments thereto. And with that being said, if we're looking for a motion to approve that recommended motion,
Make a motion to approve the recommended motion.
I'll second it.
any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion for final approval of code adoption has been approved. With that, do we have any other staff reports?
Not at this time.
Okay, we'll call for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor of adjourning, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.